Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started on the 26th of February, has completed 6 months, and there are still no signs of de-escalation. According to the United Nations, the war has displaced more than 8 million people, with more than 6.5 million people crossing over into neighboring countries. More than 5,500 civilians have been killed and close to 8,000 have been injured, though the true total is expected to be much higher. Ukrainian military claims the invasion has seen some 9,000 Ukrainian troops killed since the conflict began. According to a study from Kyiv School of Economics, the war has caused over $108 billion in damage to Ukraine's infrastructure and around $600 billion in overall damage to the economy. Ukraine has claimed that Russian missile strikes have targeted and destroyed tons of Ukrainian infrastructure, including railways, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, and shopping malls. Both the US and Ukraine's European allies have offered billions of dollars in aid and weaponry support to the country since the war began. US has provided about $10.6 billion so far in military aid. Not just that, the NATO allies have also attempted to isolate Russia with a united, coordinated package of sanctions, including banning Russian oil and gas imports. But despite the economic impact, Russia remains determined in its adventure and continues to step up its offensive. Russian President Putin has ordered the Russian military to increase its troop deployment in Ukraine. So what's the road ahead really? Joining us now to discuss this further is strategic affairs expert Brahma, professor at the Center for Policy Research, and Ukrainian MP Oleksiy Goncharenko. Brahma, let me begin by asking you, when the war began, Russia called it a special operation limited to Lugansk and the Donetsk region. They also vowed to take over Kyiv within a matter of days. They have not been able to take control of Ukraine the way they wanted to, or fulfill the claims made initially. Where do we stand in the war as of now, and how do you think this is going to progress in the months to come?
When we think of a war, we think of a victor and a loser. But in this war, there will be no victor, there will be only losers. And the losers will include the Western camp. The West set out to achieve two goals: a resounding defeat of Russia on the battlefield and undermining the Russian economy through unprecedented sanctions. Both those goals today look really distant. So for all sides, for Ukraine in particular, which is suffering devastating destruction, but even for Russia, the costs have been immense. For all sides, this war is going to be a lose-lose proposition. And I think the longer this war continues, the greater the devastation in Ukraine, and also the greater will be the costs for the West. We talk only about the costs of Ukraine, the costs of Russia, but the West, Europe in particular, is also paying significant costs. And most importantly, let's not forget that this war has spawned a global energy crisis and a global food crisis. So this war is unique in the sense that it impacts the entire world.
Right. Important points there. Oleksiy Goncharenko, let me ask you, do you feel that we are at a decisive moment as far as this war is concerned? Does Ukraine expect support from the West, which can actually help turn this war once and for all and repel the Russian attack? Do you think that can happen?
Hello. First of all, I want to react to what I've heard with Mr. Chellaney. Not the war is causing the energy crisis, food crisis, but who started this war? Russia started this war, so Russia is the author of all these crises. Speaking about loss, there's certainly every war is loss. There is no normal person in the world who can think that war can benefit to somebody except Putin. He is an insane person. He can think so, but for every other people, it's clear that who lost this war. Russia already lost this war. I just want to remind you that Putin was telling that they will take Kiev in 3 days. Now it's the 7th month of the war, and they don't have any chance to take Kiev. And all of their emphasis is now in the southern and eastern part of Ukraine. And during last month and a half, they don't have any territorial gains. So the Russia is definitely losing this war. But how much time will it take for them to finally understand it, to retreat from the territory of Ukraine? That is the question. Answering your question about Western support, yes, we are very thankful for all support we are receiving. And this support is becoming bigger and bigger. And speaking from a military point of view, Ukrainian army today is stronger than it was on February 24. And Russian army today is much weaker because our weaponry we are receiving from the West, we're receiving more and more the most modern and sophisticated weaponry. And Russia is losing all the best weapons they have. And they don't have any allies who will help them. The only countries which supported Russia in the United Nations were Northern Korea, Sudan, Venezuela, and Eritrea. That's all. That's all of their, and Syria. That's all of their allies on the planet.
Right. Let me get in Brahma Chellaney once again. Brahma Chellaney, do you think Russia will walk away from this war? What kind of a face saver would they be looking at? Because the Western support is not going to stop. That is only going to increase further. Do you think at some point Putin is going to pull back? And what could possibly lead to that?
Well, let's be clear. First, Russia today controls at least 1/5 of Ukraine. 1/5 of Ukraine is under Russian occupation. It's unlikely that Russia will retreat from Ukraine. The war gains it has made, it will seek largely to retain. And the unprecedented Western sanctions thus far have failed to make a dent on the Russian military strategy. Russia has not only withstood the brunt of the Western sanctions, but also is determined to stay put in Ukraine and to consolidate its territorial gains. The time has come for all sides to negotiate a ceasefire by launching serious peace talks, or else there'll be more devastation, more killings, and the global energy and food crises will escalate with devastating consequences for the poorer countries. We have seen Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is just one example of how the poorer countries are bearing the brunt of the global energy and food crisis that this war has triggered. And then there are these larger issues. For example, as the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair has pointed out, the world today is at a turning point in history. And the Ukraine war shows that the West's dominance is coming to an end. Unfortunately, this wholly punitive approach that the West has adopted toward Russia is only strengthening Putin's grip on power at home and driving Russia and China closer together. A Russia-China strategic axis is something that works against Western interests, especially American interests. So for American policy to drive Russia and China closer together is actually undermining America's own long-term interests.
Right. Oleksiy, Goncharenko, let me get you in at this point. How badly has the Ukrainian economy been hit over the last 6 months? And from a Ukrainian point of view, the Russian goals have not been achieved. But what kind of a compromise or what kind of a solution would be all right to the Ukrainian political setup, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government? Are they still sticking to the fact that Russia must retreat completely before any negotiations would be successful?
Speaking about economy, certainly Ukrainian economy is suffering badly. It's hard to predict, but we will lose until the end of the year probably near 1/3 of our economy. That is estimations, and definitely that is very difficult. Speaking about what is acceptable and not acceptable for us. When I hear about negotiations, Ukraine is ready for negotiations today, but about what? Negotiations about concession of our territories? No, we will never go to these negotiations. We're not interested in these negotiations. We can't leave our people. We can't leave millions of Ukrainians under occupation because Russia is committing genocide against them, killing, raping, destroying everything on the occupied territories. We can't do this. If to speak about when Russia will retreat, at least to the positions on February 24, we're ready to speak about it today. No problems about to speak about it. But speaking about, I'm on Indian channel, and I want to address to Indian viewers and ask them, do they think that international order should work? Do they think that international law should work? All bigger country, big and aggressive country can attack its neighbor and take whatever it wants. Because if Putin would be successful in any way, if Ukraine would agree for any territorial concessions, it will mean that this is the way to change borders, to solve the conflicts. It's just to attack and to destroy and to kill. That would be a very bad example for the whole planet, and the results will fill people throughout the whole planet. So I'm sure that in interest of any person on the planet is that international law should be restored. And international law is Ukrainian territory in its boundaries, which we have, in which we are accepted by Russia. It's not a boundaries which Russia was not accepting. We have a number of documents and treaties with Russia where they acknowledged our territory, that it is Ukraine. And now they just want to, because they feel that they want to do it. But fortunately for the whole world, they can't.
Right, right. Important points there. Let me go back to Brahma, Chellaney. Brahma, Chellaney, just yesterday we saw India for the first time voting against Russia at a UNSC vote. This was procedural. This was in the context of Volodymyr Zelensky addressing the UNSC. Russia had, of course, voted against the proposal. How do you see India's stance there? Do you think we should not be reading too much about the stand that India took in this case?
Well, much of the world has taken a neutral stance. If you look at all the major non-Western democracies, and India is only one of them, all of them have chosen the path of neutrality. But there are larger issues that are weighing on the minds of policymakers in the developing world in particular, but in the non-Western world as a whole. The US military aid to Ukraine averages more than $160 million a day. It dwarfs annual US aid to any other country, including Afghanistan at the height of the US war there. And just a couple of days ago, President Biden announced almost $3 billion in additional American military aid to Ukraine. The question is, will this be an endless war? Because the Americans are sinking more and more military aid into Ukraine. The Russians seem determined to consolidate their war gains. And the consequences of this war are being felt across the world. So given those realities and given the impacts on the poorer countries, the time has come for international diplomacy to begin looking for ways to end this war. Because at the moment, the West, Ukraine, and Russia seem determined to continue the war. So it's time for the rest of the world to intervene and find a path toward peace.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. The US midterm elections are more than 70 days away, and President Joe Biden's approval ratings have been on a slippery slope. So in a bid to regain the voters' trust, the White House has announced a slew of populist measures to regain the voters' confidence. The significant decision was on abortion rights. President Biden signed an executive order to help women travel out of the state to access abortion facilities. Biden also introduced an Inflation Reduction Act, which aims to curb inflation by reducing the deficit, lowering prescription drug prices, and investing into clean energy. President Biden also signed an executive order to kickstart the implementation process of a $280 billion CHIPS Act to boost domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. And in a bid to woo young voters, the president has said he will waive off $10,000 worth of student loans. So will these measures give President Biden an edge in the upcoming midterm election? What are the key issues that the voters want addressed? Taking this forward, I'm joined by Nelson Cunningham, Vice Chair, McClarty Associates, and Amber Phillips, political reporter at the Washington Post. Nelson Cunningham, if I can begin with you, how important is the midterm election? A few months back, Biden was losing popularity. Do you feel the abortion rights issue will perhaps be the most critical in this election?
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be on with Amber Phillips, who I read whenever her byline appears in the Washington Post. Wonderful to see you. Thank you for including both of us. 4 months ago, election was trending strongly away from Democrats and toward the Republicans. The midterm election is critical because Biden's hold on the Congress is extraordinarily narrow. The Senate is literally 50-50. The House, which is much larger, has only a few votes. He cannot accomplish anything unless he holds on to both houses. The next years of his presidency will be effectively a dead unless he is able to blunt Republican gains and to maintain control, if he can, of both houses. 4 months ago, I would have said it was highly unlikely he'd be able to do that. The abortion rights decision, which you mentioned earlier this summer, began to change the narrative. That there was a terrible shooting in Uvalde, Texas, which killed many young children. That led to a bipartisan gun deal, which is something that Congress has been able to act on this, followed by the CHIPS Act, which you mentioned, which again garnered bipartisan support to support our semiconductor chip industry. There was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and on and on and on. The last several months have seen a change in my view, in the fundamental position of this election. And we've seen that play out in some of the by-elections and some of the that we've seen in past weeks.
Right. Amber Phillips, just to get you in, as far as the polls right now, what do the polls indicate as far as the midterm race for the House of Representatives, for the Senate, and for other local elections in the U.S.? What are the odds?
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer because there's so many elections, right, that are happening in November. But I think Nelson is right that the past couple months, and we're really seeing it play out in the past couple weeks, especially this week, there is a fundamental change in how American voters feel about who they want to represent them. So one poll that we look at a lot here in America to tell us who voters might want to represent them in Congress is called the generic ballot. And it's if you ask a voter, would you rather have a Democrat, a nameless Democrat, or a nameless Republican represent you in Congress? Just to get at that pure partisanship that we have quite a bit here in America. Republicans have been leading by a lot in this, and that historically suggests that they'd be able to pick up maybe dozens of seats in the House and take back that slim majority in the Senate that Nelson was talking about. That being said, Democrats are catching up and even by some measures leading just a tiny bit in this poll about the generic ballot. And that suggests that at least for right now, the midterms are still a couple months out, there is an energy among Democrats, and it's mostly tied to abortion, although I do see evidence that concerns about democracy, and President Biden talked about this week. He called Republicans semi-fascists. I do see that bubbling up as well as a concern among Democratic voters. And it suggests, I think it's a long shot that Democrats could keep the House, but it does suggest that they could maybe keep the Senate and a lot of these very important state and local and gubernatorial elections.
Right. Nelson Cunningham, coming back to you, and this is a point that Amber had also said that Biden recently, in one of the political rallies, had said that you need to save democracy once again. You need to go out and vote. He was urging all Democrats to come out and vote in big numbers. Why do you think this is so crucial for Biden and a poor show in the midterms? How could this affect Democrats in the days to come after the 8th of November?
Well, that's an excellent question. One of the issues we have in America, as a Democrat, I'll say, we often say we're not members of an organized party, we're Democrats. Democrats are famous for not aligning well, for not being as disciplined as Republicans of the fundamental issues of voting. And so Democrats tend to vote less regularly than Republicans. So even though Republicans may be a smaller percentage of the electorate, they turn out more, and therefore that gives them more power. Biden is trying to change that around. He is trying to get Democrats enthused, turn out at the polls. Republicans in state after state are trying to tighten voting laws to make it harder for people to vote, because they know that their voters, Republicans who tend to be more disciplined, will turn out even in the face of bureaucratic obstacles. Democrats may be discouraged and may not vote. This is a state-by-state battle that's been fought for years, but will come to a head this fall. It is Biden's challenge, along with the other Democrats who are running between now and November 8th, to get Democrats unified, enthused, supporting the candidates who they are putting up for governor, senator, for House, and get them up and voting. And I would say that we have seen a sea change in how voters might be reacting. I think the statistics that Amber Phillips quoted are right on and are very important here. Biden fails, it may be the end of his effective presidency. We saw both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton lost one or both houses after their first 2 years. And although in broad strokes they had successful presidencies, it limited their ability to pass legislation. And that, of course, is critical to really being able to accomplish what the nation needs.
What's the imprint of Donald Trump on the Republican campaign in this midterm election, Nelson Cunningham?
Well, my Republican friends, when I ask them, all say that if Donald Trump does run, if Donald Trump does in the primary process, he is highly likely to defeat all the other Republican candidates. He did it last time in 2017, and they frankly see a repeat of that in the Republican primary process. Then we get to the general election. He still holds powerfully onto his support across the country. I will say, and this is very topical, I used to be a federal prosecutor in New York. I used to work for Rudy Giuliani, oddly enough, before his latest chapter. So I have been following very closely Trump's legal problems, including the search of his home in Mar-a-Lago, which found highly classified information that he had improperly taken from the White House, and that both he and his lawyers had neglected to turn over despite repeated requests from the federal government. It's astonishing and appalling to me as a prosecutor that he would be in that position. But my point is, it is beginning to shape voter sentiment about Trump, and will be to his detriment, at least in a general campaign, if fail in a primary.
All right, my final question to Amber Phillips. Amber, do you expect some more economic measures to be announced by the Biden administration to keep the support of the Democrats up in the run-up to the midterm election?
I'm not sure what else they can do. That's a good question. I think what comes next is for Democrats led by President Biden to campaign on all the legislation and some of the executive orders that you talked about at the beginning of this segment. And the main economic one is one that Democrats call the Inflation Reduction Act. And they're really hoping it lives up to the name. Economists I've talked to say, we don't know yet. But what it does is it lowers prescription drug costs for millions of Americans. And they hope that ripples out to the rest of America as well. And then it also invests the US's largest investment ever in trying to mitigate climate change. And as President Biden talks about, in trying to boost clean jobs here in America. So that's something that they're going to campaign on. That being said, it takes a while for this to go into effect and for voters perhaps to feel the effect on their wallets. Gas is going down, but as we all know, presidents or world leaders individually don't have much say in gas and oil prices. And so I think that President Biden and Democrats mostly are just trying to cross their fingers and hope that they can convince voters that they're trying to make the economy better, because that is still very much top of mind for many, many voters here in America. But a lot of this is out of their hands and has been for a while, especially inflation.
All right. So it'll be an interesting race, and it'll be good to have Amber Phillips and Nelson Cunningham back on CNBC TV 18 in the weeks to come. Thank you once again for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view on the midterm race in the United States. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.